Good morning. The question for today is, what drives the engines of history? What is it that launches voyages of exploration? What is it that sends soldiers, sailors, conquistadors out to create great empires that sprawl across the world? What is it that causes these great changes in human affairs? Is it the ambitions of powerful, perhaps tyrannical, despotic men and women? The answer is, well, yes, sometimes yes. Alexander the Great of Greece conquered all of the known world and was said at the end of, when he'd reached the Indus River, the boundaries of known civilization, to have wept that there were no more worlds to conquer. If not for the ambitions of Alexander, the Greek world would not have expanded the way it did. Was it, and other individuals, Napoleon. Napoleon had this idea that French civilization, embodied by Napoleon himself, should bring order to Europe after the chaos of the French revolutions and the struggles that it gave rise to. Women got in on the act as well. Catherine the Great of Russia expanded Russian influence far into Asia and to the south, building the basis for what would become the modern Russian Empire, the modern Soviet Union. Queen Victoria of Britain presided over the greatest empire the world had ever seen. It was said at the height of British power in the late 19th century that the sun never set on the British Empire. So yes, indeed, human ambition, the goal of individuals, the drive of individuals to impress their mark on the world does sometimes give rise to these great movements in history. Other possibilities. Is it the desire for riches? Is it the desire for gold? Is it the lust for that yellow metal that shines? Is that what drives history? Is that what creates empires? Well, the answer there is yes, sometimes that is the case as well. When the conquistadors conquered Mexico and Peru, they were indeed driven by gold, and they found gold and silver and the great riches that they found, that Cortez in Mexico, Pizarro in South America sent back to Spain, made Spain the greatest empire of its day. The California Gold Rush triggered a mass movement of people to the west coast of the United States, probably the greatest, the most rapid mass movement of people in, well, certainly in modern world history until then. And it changed the face of California, it changed the face of the United States. It's one of the reasons the United States became a great, well, Americans don't like the term empire, but a great power in the 20th century. Is it the desire to impose one's religious views on the world? Well, yeah, that plays a part as well. So when the Spanish and the Portuguese struggled for primacy in the world of the 15th and 16th centuries, they were driven in part by a desire to promote the Roman Catholic version of Christianity. When the Muslims the Arab Muslims spread out of what's now Saudi Arabia in the 8th and 9th centuries, they had in mind a burning desire to spread Islam to parts of the world that had never seen it before. So religion plays a large role in these great events of history. So these what would you call them? I guess you could call them the things we ordinarily associate with the driving forces of history. Those are sometimes involved. But sometimes the engines of history are moved by rather, well, quite more mundane items. Sometimes it's as simple as what people want to put in their mouth, what people want to put on their dinner, what people want to breathe into their lungs, what people want to inject into their veins. Christopher Columbus was motivated to discover the Americas. Not that he knew the Americas were there. He wasn't looking for new continents. He wasn't looking for a new world. He was looking for a new way to get hold of the spices of the East Indies, of China. And he knew that he could make himself wealthy. He could make his employers the rulers of Spain very wealthy if he found a new route to the Indies. And why? What was he looking for? Again, these spices, these black pepper in particular. It was something that would make meat that was getting a little bit old taste a little bit better. It would mask the kind of rotten smell of, in those days before you could refrigerate things. And so what we take for granted, pepper, the kinds of things that you can buy on in the seasoning aisle of your local supermarket. These were things that would prompt people to go to the ends of the earth in search of. Christopher Columbus didn't quite make it to the end of the earth. He didn't make it all the way to China, but it was his desire to acquire a route to these spices that led to the discovery of the Americas and that led to the rise of the Spanish Empire. So the spices were a principal impetus to this. When the English started settling in America, the first successful permanent English colony was in Virginia. And the Virginians came to America with a twin purpose. They were going to search for gold because they knew that the Spanish had discovered gold in the Americas and they thought they could too. Why should the Spanish get all that good stuff? They also came, at least on paper, to spread the word of God. Now, by this time, the Protestant Reformation of the 16th century had taken place, and the English wanted to make sure that the heathen souls of the New World were not all made into Roman Catholics, papists, as the Protestants called them, derisively. They wanted to save the souls of the American Indians, the native peoples of America, for the Protestant gospel. But, in fact, it wasn't gold that allowed the Virginia colony to get a foothold, and it wasn't any kind of true missionary spirit that kept them going. What saved the Virginia colony was tobacco. Tobacco was a plant that had been known to the inhabitants of the Americas for many, many generations. And they recognized that when you ingested the stuff, especially if you smoked it, it gave you a little bit of a buzz. And the colonists, they had known of this from the Spanish. The Spanish had encountered tobacco, and they felt the effects of nicotine. And so when the Virginians found themselves on the verge of collapsing, when they didn't find any gold, when the missionary zeal faded out, they turned to tobacco. And they planted some tobacco seeds brought from South America. And it so happened that the soil and the climate of Virginia were such that tobacco would thrive. And within a generation or two, the Virginians were producing tobacco by, well, the unit of account was the hogshead. It's a very large volume. But they were producing tobacco by the thousands of pounds and then the thousands of tons of tobacco. And this was a wonderful sort of thing to export because in contrast to, say, pepper or spices, which you can do without if you have to, once people get on the nicotine habit, it's really hard to kick. In fact, it was so hard to kick that the British authorities, the British monarch, tried to outlaw tobacco, saying this is a nasty habit. Now, it wasn't really out of concern for the health of the people in Britain who were smoking it. It was because at the time, it was taking money from English coffers and handing it over to the Spanish, who had control of most of the tobacco supply. But as tobacco became this big business in Virginia, then the British Crown became reconciled to this. And it's fair to say that tobacco saved the Virginia colony. It would be too much to say that if not for tobacco, the English experiment of colonization in North America would have failed. No, it would have been attempted elsewhere. They didn't grow tobacco in Massachusetts Bay, although tobacco would take hold and become a mainstay of the New England economy in places like Connecticut. But tobacco was one of those things that demonstrated that colonies could pay for themselves. And if you're going to build an empire, if you're somebody who wants to build an empire, even if you have that overweening ambition yourself, you have to figure out some way to pay for it. And if you can find a crop like tobacco that is readily cultivated and prospers in a particular piece of territory that you have control over, well then you can make a go of it. And so Virginia went from being on the verge of starvation, literally. The Virginians were about to be starved out and they were going to give it up. There had been a colony established in what is now the modern Carolinas that had failed. And Virginia might have failed too, but for the discovery of tobacco. So that by the end of the 18th century, by let's say the beginning of the American Revolution in the 1770s, tobacco was the most important export of the American colonies, and it had made Virginia the most populous of the English colonies in North America. It had done something else as well. It had helped fix slavery upon the economy of Virginia and the other colonies as well. When the English arrived in Virginia, they didn't have slaves. They didn't think they needed slaves. They didn't know what they would do with slaves. Slavery existed in the world, but it didn't have much of an appeal to the English. But the Virginians get to Virginia, and at first, okay, they don't need any more labor than they could provide themselves. And that's the critical thing from an economic standpoint. But once they discovered tobacco, once they discovered that tobacco could grow, and furthermore, when they learned that tobacco was a very labor-intensive crop to grow, they needed labor. They tried to compel the Indians in the neighborhood into working for them, but the number of Indians was under regular and severe stress from the diseases that the Europeans introduced. And furthermore, the Indians didn't like being forced to labor on these tobacco plantations, and they would run away. They would run away into the mountains, where they would blend into the other Indian population. So compelling the Indians to work, that didn't work out so well. The English brought in indentured servants. Indentured servants are people who agree, at least at first, they agree to work for a certain number of years in exchange for their transport from England to America. The idea was you agree to work for 5 years, 7 years, perhaps a little bit longer, and then at the end of that time, you are free. And in some cases, you are given some land, or at least you have an opportunity to acquire land cheaply. People who were having a hard time in England, and there were a lot of people who were, thought that this looked like a pretty good deal. And sometimes it was even a better deal for their children. Very often parents of kids don't think so much about themselves, but they think about, will my children be any better off than me, or will my children be worse off? And America looked like a place where there was opportunity. So these English men and women agreed to come over, and they would work. They would be almost temporary slaves. They couldn't exactly be bought and sold, but their contracts could. And the key was it was for a limited term. So after a while, it was kind of like being an apprentice, but you didn't learn a particular trade. But anyway, so after a while, it was over. But the problem with this was that in Virginia is in a part of the United States that by the standards, by comparison with England itself, was almost subtropical. And there were diseases that were endemic, that is, were commonly found in Virginia and the Chesapeake region, that decimated the population of English workers when they came, and especially the ones who had to work long and hard in the fields. And so they tended to die off. So after trying Indians, after trying indentured servants, the Virginians turned to African slaves. There was already an active slave industry that involved tribes in Africa enslaving members of other tribes and transporting them to the coast, where they would be purchased by European slave traders and carried off to different parts of the world. And the parts of the world included the Mediterranean, included India, included the Americas, once the American colonies of Spain and then Portugal and then the English and the French were established. And so Virginians in 1619 imported the first cargo, and that's the way they thought of it, the first ship of slaves. And these were, African slaves. And these were Africans. It was a little bit unclear what their status was and what slavery meant at the time, but the way it evolved was that the slaves were permanently slaves. And here's the critical thing, that slavery was inherited by the children of slaves, or more precisely, by the children of slave mothers, because you can almost always tell who the mother of a child is. And so slavery emerged, slavery arose. Slavery was affixed in Virginia in response to the demand of the tobacco growers for this source of reliable labor. Over time, slaves were applied to all other manner of work. In time, for example, tobacco would largely be supplanted by cotton, and the demand for slaves on the part of the cotton plantation owners would boom in the 19th century, and the number of slaves in America would grow dramatically. But in the case of tobacco, to get us back where we started, it was all a matter of, so what do these people, these consumers in England originally, but in other parts of Europe and then in America itself, they want to get their nicotine fix. And it's this desire of these individuals for their nicotine fix that gave rise to Virginia, the slave trade, the institution, the industry of slavery in the United States. Now again, it's not to say that absent tobacco, none of this stuff would have happened. But it certainly wouldn't have happened the same way that it did. And the driving force, if you want to know the driving force, was this desire of people, to get their smokes. In later times, other commodities would develop. So once the Europeans got to China, especially, but also to the Indies, they discovered a drink that had some of the same kind of effects as tobacco. They discovered tea. And tea has lots of caffeine, and you drink the tea and get the caffeine, you get this buzz, and it makes your mind feel sharper, it wakes you up in the morning, it sort of gets you going. If you've never had tea, or coffee would have the same effect. Coffee would be a little bit later, as I'll explain. But if you've never been introduced to them, you don't know what you're missing. But once you start it, it's a habit that is pretty hard to do without. And the British got in the habit of taking tea from China and the Indies and transporting it all over the world. And a large corporation, the British East India Company, took tea from the Indies and sold it in the Americas, sold it in England, sold it wherever they could sell it. And in fact, so tea became the morning drink, the afternoon drink of the American colonists. And they didn't think it had much political importance. They didn't think it was going to be a driver of history until along come the troubles leading up to the American Revolution. And one of the complaints of the Americans, the American colonists within the British Empire, was that the British government in London was giving favorable treatment to the British East India Company in the sale of tea. Merchants in America who wanted to get tea from other suppliers found themselves at the mercy of the East India Company monopoly. And the East India Company had the monopoly because it had friends in Parliament. And to Americans, this seemed a glaring example of corruption in British politics. So those people who had an inside track on things, they were the ones who could twist policy in their favor. Americans complained about the corruption of the British government. And corruption at certain moments focused on tea. The Boston Tea Party of 1773 was a protest against the British East India Company's favored position in the tea trade in the American colonies. And it was a protest that took the form of the vandalizing, the theft of a cargo of tea from vessels that had brought it, the tea that was owned by the East India Company, and dumping all the tea into Boston Harbor. And so the Boston Tea Party resonated in America. This was a protest about what the British government were doing to this fundamental aspect of American life. Again, you think about it, a cup of tea, is that all that big a deal? Well, sometimes history sort of turns on these particular things. And something else, that it was as protest against the Tea Act, the one that gave rise to the Boston Tea Party, that Americans started drinking coffee in large numbers. coffee originated in East Africa, and it migrated, made its way to the Middle East for the same reason that tea caught on. The people who drank coffee discovered, okay, this makes me feel good, it makes me feel smarter, I have more energy. Stimulants like caffeine, they're biologically active, and they really do give you this lift. And so from the Middle East, it made its way to Europe, and finally to America. Now the British and the Americans until this point still thought of themselves as British. They favored tea, in part because of the position that the East India Company, the other British tea distributors, had. So Americans favored tea like the British did. But in protest of the Tea Act and British tea policy, Americans for the first time started drinking coffee. And coffee became this big deal in America, much a bigger deal than in Britain. And in fact, until fairly recently, the British still favored tea while the Americans drank coffee. And coffee is this global phenomenon. And it's very much a part of modern life. At other times, at later times, other substances that people just can't do without figured largely in the politics of empires. So in the 18th century, in the early 19th century, opium was favored among certain groups in Europe, in America. Opium, this naturally occurring property of opium poppies, has a really positive effect in deadening pain, but it also gives you this feeling of well-being, this kind of euphoria. And people had been ingesting opium in various forms for a long time. They would smoke it, or they would drink it, or they would brew it up, or they would do all sorts of things. And they would have their opium. And opium, much more so than caffeine, much more so than nicotine, is quite addictive. And once you get hooked on opium, and it's a combination of you feel so good when you take it, and then as a sign of physical addiction, you feel really bad when you don't take it. And so once you get hooked on opium, you really have to have it. And the British recognized that, boy, this is a good product to be in the business of selling. For decades, the British had been buying things from China, but they didn't have much that the Chinese wanted to buy in return. And the British in those days, like governments today, including the government of the United States under President Trump, have been concerned about negative balances of trade, where if you buy more from another country than you sell to another country, then the feeling is that you're losing employment opportunities in your country, and too many dollars are going out of the country, or in those days, too much gold and silver is going out of the British Empire. So the British government decided, we've got to come up with something that the Chinese will want to buy from us. And what they came up with was opium. And opium was grown, could be grown in India, which by this time the British controlled, and it could be sold in China. And it's addictive. And so once people get hooked on this stuff, they're going to keep buying your product. And from the standpoint of somebody trying to sell something, if you've got an item that people have to have, then this is a way of guaranteeing an ongoing business opportunity. The Chinese government became alarmed at this, in part because of the number of Chinese who were getting addicted to opium, in part because now all of a sudden money was flowing out of China, and the Chinese wanted to keep the money in just the way the British wanted on their side. And so the Chinese government passed laws against the use of opium, against the sale of opium, basically outlawing opium. And the British decided that this was intolerable. And they didn't say, okay, we're in favor of addicting people on opium. No, that's not the case you had made. What the British said was, we believe in free trade. We believe in the right of people to purchase whatever they want. We believe in our right as the sellers of these products to sell whatever we want, wherever we want. And the Chinese government resisted, which led the British government to send warships to China. And it fought a war called the Opium War, which was for the purpose of forcing China to allow Europeans to trade in China. And really, this was all about expanding and protecting Britain's opium trade in China. So and by the way, this Opium War of the late 1830s, the early 1840s, touched off what the Chinese have long called their century of humiliation, where they were at the mercy of stronger Western powers. It was only after the Communist Party came to power in the 1940s and 1950s that the Chinese were able to regain control of their affairs in a way that allowed them to regain what they considered to be their place at the center of world affairs. But for years after, even until now, the Chinese talk about the century of humiliation that began with the Opium Wars. So when you think about all of this stuff, these little things that have these great effects. Oh, so there's something else I mentioned, and some of the things that I've talked about, fall in the category of drugs, and drugs are really a big deal in all of this. But there are other things that are more innocuous. So something as simple as sugar. Sugar probably, the kind of thing you sprinkle on your cereal, you put in your coffee, you use in all manner of things. Sugar was essentially unknown in Europe and much of the world before about the 15th or 16th centuries because it was really hard to grow. Sugar cane is how people got sugar, but sugar cane didn't grow anywhere in Europe. But once the European countries found colonies where the sugar might grow, then they could import it from the places that it originated and create sugar plantations. Oh, and by the way, so here is an important principle in all of this. So if a mundane item like tobacco or tea or coffee, something as everyday as that, is going to drive history, it has to be something that has very broad appeal. It can be, from the standpoint of the seller, ideally it should be addictive, let's say like opium, or maybe like caffeine, maybe, or nicotine, cigarettes, tobacco, so it should have that property, but that alone won't make it drive history. It will drive history if it can only grow in certain places on Earth. So, for example, alcohol is perhaps the most widely used, historically mood-altering drug in human history. Alcohol never created empires, and there's a good reason for this, because alcohol can be produced anywhere. Alcohol can be made out of almost anything that grows, and so people can make alcohol out of grain, they can make alcohol out of grapes, they can make alcohol out of potatoes, anywhere people can farm and grow their food, they can make alcohol. And so you don't have to acquire an empire, you don't have to found colonies in order to get access to your alcohol. And something like marijuana falls in this category as well. Empires were not built on marijuana. There were drug cartels that were built on marijuana, but empires weren't built on marijuana because marijuana can grow in all sorts of places. You don't have to go to some place particular to import it, and to produce it and then import it from there. So in this category of these little things, these simple things that drove history, there's some simple things will do it, other simple things won't. To get us down, I'll take an example of here. This isn't something that you actually ingest, not usually, but it's something that also highlights one of the principles of this, and that is that these things that can move, basically can build empires or expand empires or drive history, can be items of fashion. In the 19th century, a fur trade developed in the American West. And this fur trade was based on the capture, the trapping of beavers. And the beavers were prized for the fur trade because although they have sort of coarse outer fur. The under fur is really soft, and in particular, it can be fashioned into this very durable kind of felt. You take the under fur and you beat it and you mix it with chemicals and you make it into this felt that was made for hats that fashionable gentlemen in London would want to wear. And when this fashion emerged for beaver hats, then it set in motion a whole train of events that led to the creation of fur empires in North America. And much of the history of the American West was about the battle among competing fur firms and competing countries. First France and Britain, and then Britain and the United States for control of the best places where you could trap the beaver. But almost as quickly as the vogue for beaver fur developed, it collapsed. Because having worn these fur hats for 20 or 30 years, those fashionable gents in London decided, you know, that's no longer fashionable. Let's switch to something else. I know, silk top hats. And the bottom fell out of the market for fur. And so this was an example, and all the other things I mentioned before are examples of early forms of globalization. Globalization is a term that developed in the late 19th century for the interconnectedness of people and individuals and activities around the world. And it became really noticeable in all parts of the world economy in the 1980s, 90s, into the early part of the 21st century. But it had its roots, well, when Columbus went off looking for spices. It had its roots when the East India Company went to India and sold tea in America. It had its roots when American and British merchants wanted to sell opium to China. So this whole business of globalization, it goes way back. And to bring us back to the question that all this started, so what is it that moves history? Is it individuals? Is it the desire for great wealth? Is it a matter of trying to spread the gospel? And the answer is, yeah, sometimes it is those. But some morning, when you happen to be sipping your coffee at Starbucks, perhaps sweetened with a little sugar, you might just reflect on the fact that as often as it is those other elements, those drivers of history, very often it's just ordinary people like you and me. Thanks.